A police officer returned to Seattle after years of duty, carrying nothing but hope and the fragile trust of his two children. Beside him walked Rocky, his loyal German shepherd, guarding them with every step. But instead of comfort and love, he was met with cruelty. His wife turning against the little ones, forcing them into fear and silence, while neighbors looked away. With nowhere to turn, a weary father, a frightened daughter, a fragile baby, and their faithful dog began a journey through betrayal, courage, and faith. What happened next would reveal how God's light breaks through even the darkest nights, showing that miracles often arrive through patience, loyalty, and the quiet strength of love. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. And if you believe no child should ever suffer in silence, hit that subscribe button, because what you are about to hear may restore your faith in love, family, and second chances. The winter night had settled over Seattle with a weight that felt almost suffocating. Snowflakes swirled through the air in ceaseless spirals, dusting the rooftops and coating the bare branches with a white sheen that glowed under the dim street lamps. The Miller residence stood near the outskirts of the city, a sprawling suburban mansion of gray stone walls and dark gables, impressive to passers-by, yet strangely lifeless, as though the warmth of family had long since drained from its halls. The air was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that crept under doors and pressed against the windows, and the faint sound of wind scraping against the trees filled the night like a restless whisper. Inside that house, an 8-year-old girl clutched her baby brother to her chest, her small frame trembling as the storm outside mirrored the storm within. Sophie Miller was a thin, fragile child with long chestnut-brown hair that often fell into her wide hazel eyes. She had a quiet, withdrawn demeanor that did not come naturally, but had been shaped by circumstance. Once she had been bright and spirited, known for darting around the garden with boundless laughter. But after her mother's death and the years under her stepmother's rule, Sophie had learned to make herself small, to speak softly, to exist without being noticed. Tonight, tears streaked her pale cheeks as she cradled Noah, her 10-month-old brother, whose downy blonde hair glistened damp with tears and whose chubby face was blotched red from crying. Noah was still a baby, innocent and unaware, yet he had already learned to cling desperately to Sophie's shirt whenever voices in the house grew sharp. Towering over them in the kitchen was Victoria Miller, Sophie's stepmother. Victoria was a woman in her late 30s with striking beauty at first glance, tall, statuesque, with waves of glossy auburn brown hair framing her sculpted face. She dressed immaculately in fitted dresses and heels, always painted lips and manicured nails, the picture of sophistication. But beneath a polished exterior burned a volatile temper and a cruelty sharpened by years of bitterness. Life had once offered Victoria dreams of modeling and wealth, but rejection, coupled with years of struggling in menial jobs, had hardened her into someone who equated power with domination. When she married David Miller, a respected Seattle police officer with a stable income, she gained not only security, but control over a household she quickly claimed as her own. To the outside world, she appeared charming, cultured, even refined. Behind closed doors, her voice could slice like a blade, her anger sudden and merciless. The incident had begun with a simple accident. Sophie had tried to pour milk into Noah's bottle, but her small hand slipped and the glass container toppled from the counter, shattering across the polished tiles. Milk spread in a white pool, carrying shards of broken glass in every direction. Sophie froze, heart hammering, her breath hitching as Noah startled in his walker and let out a sharp cry of fear. She dropped to her knees quickly, whispering apologies to no one in particular. But before she could pick up more than a piece or two, Victoria's heels struck the floor like gunfire. "What did you do now?" Victoria's voice was low at first, coiled with restrained fury, but as her eyes landed on the mess and then on Sophie's trembling form, her anger flared. "I'm sorry, I'll clean it right away," Sophie whispered, reaching for another shard, despite the blood already beading from a cut on her small fingers. "Clean it? You clumsy brat!" Victoria lunged forward, seizing Sophie's thin arm and jerking her upright so forcefully that the shards clattered again. Noah wailed louder, his small fists flailing in the air as if he too wanted to protest. Victoria shoved the crying baby into Sophie's arms. "Take this useless little screamer with you. You two deserve to be treated like the animals you are." Dragging them down the hallway, Victoria's grip was like iron. Sophie stumbled, trying to shield Noah from the jerks and jolts, her heart racing with terror. The back door burst open under Victoria's push, and the night wind surged in, sharp and biting. She marched them across the snow-dusted yard to the far corner, where an old wooden shed stood, once a tool storage, now little more than a rotting structure with peeling paint and a warped door. It smelled faintly of mildew, and the lock on its latch had rusted with age. Victoria yanked the door open, shoved Sophie and Noah inside, and slammed it shut with finality. The lock clicked. Sophie fell to the ground, still clutching Noah tightly, her knees bruising against the cold planks. Noah's cries echoed in the cramped space, his sobs muffled only by Sophie's shoulder as she rocked him, whispering, "Don't be afraid. I'm here. I won't let anyone hurt you." But her own voice trembled, betraying the cracks in her fragile resolve. From outside, Victoria's voice sliced through the darkness. "Look at you, filthy like rats. That girl is always ruining everything, and that boy is nothing but noise. If it weren't for your father's blind trust, I would have thrown you both out long ago. Remember this. If you breathe a word to him, you'll suffer 10 times worse." Her heels clicked away, the sound fading until only Noah's sobs remained. At the shed's corner, another figure had been watching. Rocky, the family's German shepherd. A powerful 6-year-old with thick black and tan fur and sharp amber eyes stood growling low, his body tense. Rocky had once been trained as a K9 service dog, but an injury to his hind leg had retired him from duty, leaving him in David's care. Loyal and intelligent, Rocky understood more than anyone realized. He had sensed the fear in Sophie's trembling body many times before, and tonight he pressed close to the shed, pawing at the door, whining softly. He tried to wedge his nose at the gap, desperate to reach the children, but Victoria had already stormed back to the house, slamming the door behind her. Rocky stayed, circling the shed like a silent guardian, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Across the snowy yard, in the modest house next door, Margaret Collins, an elderly widow in her 70s, stood at her kitchen window, watching. Margaret was short and stooped from years of arthritis, her silver hair tied in a simple bun, her eyes watery, yet still sharp with the clarity of experience. She had lived beside the Miller family for decades, long before David remarried, and she had adored Sophie's late mother, who used to bring her roses from the garden. Since the new wife had moved in, Margaret had grown uneasy with the tense silence that seemed to hang over the once lively home. Tonight, the cries of children had cut through the wind, breaking her heart. She stepped out onto her porch, clutching her shawl tighter around her frail shoulders, and called across the fence, "Is everything all right over there?" Victoria's silhouette appeared in the doorway, her voice deceptively calm, but her eyes flashing like daggers. "Mind your own business, Margaret. This is my family, and I don't need old women poking their noses where they don't belong." Margaret flinched at the venom in her tone and retreated slowly, but not before she cast one last worried glance toward the shed. She could still hear the muffled cries, could still see Rocky pacing anxiously. Her heart ached, but fear for her own safety stilled her feet. She closed her door with trembling hands, whispering to herself, "Dear God, please protect those children." Inside the shed, Sophie pressed her forehead to the wooden boards, eyes squeezed shut, whispering her own prayer into the darkness. "Please, someone come. Don't leave us here." Noah whimpered against her chest, and Rocky outside let out another mournful cry that seemed to echo her plea. The night deepened, the snow thickened, and the old Miller house loomed like a fortress of silence, its secrets hidden under the frozen blanket of Seattle's winter storm. The next morning, the snow had not relented. Seattle's streets lay beneath a heavy white quilt, cars buried up to their tires, and the sky sagged with the weight of more clouds to come. In the Miller house, silence reigned, broken only by the faint cry of Noah still exhausted from the cold night. Sophie, bleary-eyed and pale, had carried him back into the living room when Victoria finally unlatched the shed door at dawn. The little girl's fingers were raw, her lips tinged blue, yet she whispered comfort to her brother, pressing her cheek against his soft blonde hair. Rocky had remained by their side, his fur matted with snow, his amber eyes vigilant, never straying far from Sophie's trembling form. Inside, Victoria prepared her morning coffee with the precision of habit, her manicured hands moving gracefully as if nothing had happened. She was dressed in a fitted burgundy blouse and dark trousers, her posture straight, her expression composed. To any stranger entering the kitchen, she would look like a capable, elegant stepmother managing her household. But Sophie knew better. Each glance from Victoria's sharp hazel eyes carried a silent warning. Across town, David Miller, a 42-year-old Seattle police lieutenant, leaned back in the passenger seat of a patrol car returning him from a 2-week assignment in Spokane. David had the rugged look of a man who had seen too much of the world's darker corners: short brown hair with streaks of silver near the temples, deep-set blue-gray eyes, and a jaw hardened by years of tension. He wore his Navy uniform with weary dignity, the badge on his chest polished, though his shoulders slumped with fatigue. He had spent the past weeks coordinating with local units on a case involving drug trafficking, long hours away from home, leaving him restless and aching for the simple laughter of his children. His colleagues respected him as a man of principle, firm yet compassionate, but those same qualities often left him stretched thin, unable to balance the demands of his badge with the fragile needs of his family. David's thoughts lingered on Sophie as the car turned toward his neighborhood. She had always been his gentle child, the one who once ran down the hallway with arms wide when he came home from shift. He had imagined her face lighting up again when he walked through the door today. He clutched the small gift box he had bought her during a stop in Spokane, a hand-painted wooden music box with a tiny ballerina inside. He pictured Sophie's eyes widening at the sound of the delicate melody, her laughter filling the silence that had haunted the house since his late wife's passing. When the car pulled up outside the gray-stoned mansion, David stepped out into the crunch of snow. The air was sharp against his skin, but a warmth spread in his chest as he walked up the path, Rocky bounding forward suddenly to greet him. The German shepherd barked once, tail wagging but body tense, his fur still, bristled as though he had been on guard all night. David frowned, crouching to ruffle the dog's head, noticing the snow clinging to Rocky's coat. "What's wrong, boy? You've been out here too long." Rocky whined, circling him urgently, then darted toward the backyard before glancing back, as if urging him to follow. David's instincts as a policeman flared. He followed quickly, boots sinking into the snow until he reached the weather-beaten shed at the yard's edge. His breath caught when he saw the warped door slightly ajar. Sophie huddled inside with Noah in her arms. The baby's cheeks were blotched from cold, his tiny hands clinging weakly to Sophie's shirt. Sophie's hair hung in messy strands across her face, her eyes wide with fear, as though she expected him not to believe what she had endured. "Oh my God," David whispered, rushing forward. He dropped to his knees, scooping both children into his arms, clutching them against his chest, as though he could erase the night they had just suffered. Sophie stiffened at first, still clutching Noah tightly, but she let herself be held, her eyes darting toward the house as if afraid her stepmother would reappear. "Daddy, I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered hoarsely, her voice so faint it nearly dissolved into the winter air. Before David could answer, a voice rang out behind him. "David, thank God you're home." It was Victoria, striding across the snow in her heels, her expression transformed into a mask of sorrow. Tears brimmed in her eyes as she reached for his arm. "They wouldn't listen. They wouldn't behave. I lost control. I only wanted to discipline them. Please, you must believe me. I love them like my own." David froze, torn between the sobbing woman before him and the trembling children in his arms. He glanced at Sophie, who bit her lip and buried her face against Noah's head, unwilling to look at him. Rocky growled low, stepping between Victoria and the children, his amber eyes fixed with accusation. David's training as a policeman screamed at him to question, to look for evidence, to weigh words against actions. But this was no case file. This was his family, his home, and the lines blurred painfully. He stood, carrying the children inside, saying nothing to Victoria as the storm outside battered against the windows. From the kitchen window of the house next door, Margaret Collins watched the scene unfold. Her thin hands trembled against the glass, her breath fogging the pain. She had never seen David return with such urgency in his eyes, and something about the way Sophie clung to him cut Margaret deeper than any words could. She thought of her own daughter, long gone to another state, who had once played with Sophie's mother in this very yard. Regret gnawed at her. She should have spoken sooner. That evening, Margaret made a decision. She pulled on her worn gray coat and shuffled across her living room to the phone. Her fingers, twisted with arthritis, dialed a number she had scribbled down weeks earlier. The office of Rachel Parker, a 28-year-old social worker. Rachel was known in the community for her stubborn compassion. Petite, with curly brown hair and warm brown eyes that could disarm even the most guarded child, she had dedicated her career to protecting the vulnerable. A childhood marked by neglect from her own alcoholic father had shaped her resolve. She had once sworn that no child under her watch would feel as invisible as she once had. When Margaret's wavering voice reached her that night, Rachel listened intently, scribbling notes, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't worry, Mrs. Collins," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the late hour. "I'll start watching the Millers more closely. If what you suspect is true, we'll find a way to protect those children." Back in the Miller house, David sat stiffly in the living room, Sophie and Noah curled up on the couch beside him, Rocky sprawled protectively at their feet. Victoria hovered in the doorway, her mascara streaked as she wept into a handkerchief. David said nothing, his eyes fixed on the flicker of the fireplace, his mind torn apart by questions. Yet somewhere in his chest, a seed of doubt had already begun to grow, watered by his daughter's trembling voice. "Daddy, I didn't do anything wrong." The Miller house stood hushed under a canopy of gray clouds, the storm that had blanketed Seattle now leaving behind slush and a bone-deep chill. Icicles clung to the gutters like sharpened teeth, and the roads outside gleamed with frozen patches that sent the occasional car skidding. Inside, however, the quiet was not peaceful, but suffocating, each creak of the old wood magnified in the silence. David Miller had returned, and though the house seemed whole again with his presence, the air was tense, heavy with truths no one dared to speak. David sat at his desk late that night, his uniform jacket draped over the back of the chair, his broad shoulders hunched as he rubbed his temples. Sleep eluded him. He could still hear Sophie's frail voice from the shed, her whispered confession. "Daddy, I didn't do anything wrong." The words gnawed at him, pulling apart the threads of trust he had once wrapped around Victoria. As a police officer, he had learned to spot liars, to read the subtle shifts in body language, the hesitation in tone. And yet, in his own home, the truth blurred. Victoria's tears had been practiced, her sobs theatrical, but his daughter's eyes had been raw, stripped of pretense. In the small bedroom down the hall, Sophie tossed in restless sleep. The dim glow of her nightlight cast pale shadows across her thin face. She clutched Noah close, even in slumber, as though afraid he might be taken away. Her lips quivered with murmurs that broke David's heart when he stood at the door listening. "Please, don't lock us in again. Daddy won't believe us." The words were a dagger twisting in his chest. He wanted to step inside, gather her up, and promise that he did believe her, but his feet felt anchored to the floor, fear and guilt chaining him. Rocky, ever vigilant, lay stretched across the hallway, ears pricked, amber eyes reflecting the dim light. The dog's breathing was steady, but when Sophie whimpered, Rocky's head lifted, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. He had once been a trained K-9 unit, and, though retired, his instincts were sharp. He sensed the unease that saturated the house, the mistrust that festered between the humans he loved. When David finally walked back to his room, Rocky padded after him, laying down just outside the door, like a sentinel unwilling to rest. The next day unfolded with an eerie calm. Victoria moved about the kitchen with careful poise, preparing breakfast as though nothing had happened. She wore a soft gray sweater and pearl earrings, her hair styled perfectly, the picture of a refined wife. Yet every flick of her eyes toward Sophie was sharp, cutting, a reminder of unspoken threats. Noah whimpered whenever Victoria drew near, his tiny arms reaching desperately for Sophie. At the dining table, Sophie sat hunched, her thin shoulders trembling as she spooned oatmeal into Noah's mouth. She ate nothing herself, chewing instead on her lower lip until it nearly bled. David, seated at the head of the table, watched closely. His eyes shifted between his daughter's fear, his son's cries, and his wife's carefully crafted smile. The policeman in him wanted to interrogate, to press harder, but the father in him feared breaking what fragile peace remained. Rocky sat under the table, his head resting on Sophie's knee. Whenever Victoria's voice sharpened, the dog's ears perked, a growl humming quietly in his chest. Sophie's small hand occasionally brushed his fur, as though drawing courage from his presence. The tension mounted when Victoria leaned forward, her tone deceptively gentle. "David, you see how she looks at me? She doesn't respect me. She's stubborn, always trying to make me the villain. I try to teach her discipline, but she twists everything." David did not respond. His jaw tightened, his hand clenched on the tablecloth. Sophie flinched at Victoria's words, lowering her gaze to Noah, spooning the food faster, her shoulders trembling. She wanted to speak, to cry out that it wasn't true, but the memory of her stepmother's threats silenced her. Later that afternoon, across the fence, Margaret Collins watched again from her kitchen window. Her heart twisted seeing Sophie walk outside, with Rocky trailing close, the girl's small figure swallowed by her oversized coat. Margaret stepped onto her porch, hesitated, then called softly, "Sophie, dear, are you all right?" Sophie froze, clutching Rocky's collar, her eyes darting back to the house. Victoria's shadow loomed at the kitchen door, and Sophie quickly shook her head, lips pressed shut, before retreating inside. Margaret sighed, her chest heavy. She shuffled back to her chair and picked up her phone. Rachel Parker answered quickly. She had been waiting for Margaret's updates since their first conversation. Rachel was petite, with curly brown hair usually tied back loosely, giving her an approachable, down-to-earth look. She wore little makeup, preferring comfort over fashion, and her round glasses often slipped down her nose when she bent over her files. But what defined Rachel most was the fire in her eyes, a fire born of her own childhood scars. She knew too well the silence of children forced into fear, and she recognized it now in Sophie. "Thank you, Mrs. Collins," Rachel said gently after listening. "I'll drive by tomorrow. I can't enter without cause, but I can observe. Sometimes that's where the truth begins." That night, David paced the hallway, the echoes of Sophie's murmured pleas in his ears. He paused outside her door again, listening to her broken whispers in sleep. "Don't take Noah away. Please don't." Rocky nudged his leg softly, as if urging him to act. David sank against the wall, burying his face in his hands. He had faced criminals, interrogated suspects, stood in courtrooms, but never had he felt so powerless. This was his daughter, his blood, and he was failing her. At dinner, the fragile balance shattered again. Victoria set plates on the table with a smile too polished to be sincere. Noah, seated in his high chair, burst into loud sobs the moment she leaned near to wipe his chin. Sophie immediately pulled him close, her eyes wide with panic. Rocky growled, a deep warning rumble, his body tense under the table. Victoria's eyes flicked with irritation, but she quickly covered it with a sigh. David caught it all, the stiffening of his daughter, the fear in his son, the dog's protective stance. He clenched his jaw, biting back the urge to confront. The evidence wasn't enough yet, but his heart told him what his mind still struggled to accept. Something was deeply wrong. Across the street, Rachel parked her old Navy sedan, notebook on her lap. She watched the warm glow of the Millers' dining room from a distance, her eyes narrowing as she scribbled observations. She could not hear the words, but she saw the tension. The way Sophie sat rigid, the way the dog never relaxed, the way David's posture was tight as if he were bracing for a storm. Rachel tapped her pen thoughtfully. This was only the beginning, but she would not let it slip into silence. The Seattle winter dragged on, the days blurring into pale gray, and the nights sinking into bitter cold. By now, the Miller mansion had become a house of whispers and watchful eyes. David Miller, once so certain of his ability to protect the innocent, now lived with doubt pressing against his chest like armor too heavy to bear. The uniform he wore each day marked him as a lieutenant, a man of justice and order, but when he came home at night, he felt only helplessness gnawing at him. His daughter's trembling, his infant son's cries, and the low growl of Rocky at the foot of the table were proof enough that something was broken. And yet, proof was what he lacked, the kind of hard evidence he would demand in any other case. One late evening, after walking the perimeter of his property with Rocky padding silently beside him, David stood in the dim glow of his garage. In his hands, he turned over a small black case, one he hadn't touched since his days supervising narcotics investigations. Inside were compact surveillance cameras, palm-sized devices, sleek and nearly invisible once mounted. He remembered using them in dingy motels and cluttered warehouses, gathering evidence that brought down dealers and smugglers. Now, he would use them in his own home. His jaw tightened at the thought. It felt like betrayal, but it was also the only way to unmask the truth. The next morning, while Victoria left to meet a friend for coffee, David worked quickly. He mounted one camera above the kitchen doorway, hidden behind a decorative clock, its small lens angled toward the table. Another he tucked into the hallway corner near the children's room, its eyes small enough to escape notice. He even placed one in the garden near the shed, the bitter memory of finding his children locked inside still vivid in his mind. Each screw tightened felt like a blade twisting deeper into his guilt. A father should not need cameras to know what his children endured, but he had been blind too long. Sophie noticed the faintest changes. She was sharp, sharper than anyone gave her credit for. The way her father moved through the house with a new gravity, the way he studied the corners, the way his eyes lingered on Victoria when she turned away. She didn't ask. Words had long ago proven dangerous. Instead, she kept Noah close, feeding him, humming softly when he cried, and finding comfort in the constant presence of Rocky. The dog followed her everywhere, his thick fur brushing against her small hands, his amber eyes never leaving her face. Rocky had become more than a guardian. He was Sophie's anchor. He was 6 years old, strong but scarred, his left hind leg bearing a faint limp from his days as a K9. Yet the injury had not dulled his vigilance. Every time Victoria raised her voice, his ears shot up. His teeth flashed in a warning growl. Sophie clung to him the way other children might cling to a favorite toy, whispering secrets into his fur because she knew he would never betray them. Meanwhile, across the street, Rachel Parker adjusted her round glasses as she parked her aging Navy sedan under a bare maple tree. She carried a camera of her own, not as advanced as David's, but effective enough for her social work documentation. Petite and approachable, Rachel often dressed plainly, today in a thick olive green coat and wool scarf. But there was a determination about her that made people trust her instantly. She had been watching the Millers for days, jotting down the subtle shifts she observed. Sophie's nervous glances, Noah's aversion to Victoria, the way the dog bristled when she came near. Margaret Collins often joined her, the older woman wrapped in her worn gray coat, her eyes lined with years of sorrow and worry. Together, they formed a quiet alliance, waiting for the moment the evidence would be undeniable. That moment came sooner than they expected. It was a bleak afternoon when Victoria's mask slipped entirely. The recording captured it first. In the kitchen, Sophie tried to balance Noah on her hip while setting the table with her free hand. A glass slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor, shattering. Immediately, Victoria's voice rang out, sharp and venomous. "Can't you do anything right, useless child?" She slapped Sophie across the cheek, the sound cracking louder than the shattering glass. Noah screamed, flailing in panic. Sophie staggered but did not drop him. She only clutched him tighter, tears streaming silently as she whispered apologies into his hair. David watched the footage that night in his study, his hand shaking so violently that the coffee cup beside him tipped and spilled across the desk. His heart pounded in his ears, rage rising like fire. He forced himself to keep watching. In another clip, Victoria shoved a plate of food onto the table. "Eat it all or you don't sleep in a bed tonight," she hissed, looming over Sophie while Noah wailed in the background. Sophie hunched low, forcing spoonfuls past her lips, her tears falling into the food. Rocky growled, stepping forward, only to be shoved aside with a kick. David's vision blurred with hot tears. He pressed his palms to his eyes, whispering, "My God." She was telling the truth all along. The final straw came 3 days later. The garden camera caught Victoria dragging Sophie and Noah back toward the shed. Sophie begged, her voice high and broken. "Please, not again, please." Victoria sneered, shoving them inside. Rocky lunged, barking ferociously, snapping at her heels. He stayed outside the door, ramming against it, his claws scraping wood as Sophie sobbed on the other side. David had been on his way home when Rocky's frenzied barking reached him from the street. He ran across the yard, heart hammering, and found the dog clawing at the shed. With a roar, he wrenched the lock open. Sophie tumbled into his arms, Noah pressed against her chest, both children shaking violently from the cold. Rocky pressed close, licking Sophie's face as she sobbed. Victoria rushed from the house, fury flashing across her features before she saw David standing there, holding the children, rage carved into every line of his face. She shifted instantly, tears filling her eyes, her voice dripping with false sorrow. "David, please, you don't understand." But this time, David did not hear her. His ears were filled only with Sophie's sobs, Noah's cries, and Rocky's low growl vibrating against his side. He carried the children inside without a word, his face pale, his fists clenched. That evening, David met Margaret and Rachel in secret. He handed Rachel a flash drive containing the footage, his hand trembling as he passed it over. Rachel's eyes hardened as she glanced at the clips on her laptop. Margaret placed a shaky hand on his arm. "You did the right thing," she whispered. David nodded, though his heart still felt like lead. "It's not enough to know," he said quietly. "Now, I need to act." The cold rain swept over Seattle the following evening, tapping against the tall windows of the Miller mansion like impatient fingers. Inside, the air was thick with tension. David Miller sat at his oak desk, the surveillance footage looping silently across his laptop screen, each image carving deeper lines into his face. Sophie was asleep upstairs with Noah in her arms. Rocky curled protectively at the foot of the bed. He had checked on them 3 times already that night, his chest tightening every time he saw his daughter's pale cheek pressed against her brother's head. No child should sleep that way, guarding another life as if she were the last wall between him and harm. Rachel Parker arrived just after 9, her scarf damp from the rain, carrying a leather satchel filled with files. Margaret followed close behind, her gray hair tucked under a wool hat, her eyes still sharp despite her years. David let them in quietly, offering no small talk. He knew words were no longer enough. Rachel placed her satchel on the desk, pulling out documents, transcripts, and her laptop where the copied footage glowed. "It's clear," she said firmly, her voice carrying the steadiness of a woman who had faced broken families before. "What Victoria has done is systematic abuse, and you," she looked at David, "you have both the power and the duty to bring this to light." David's jaw tightened. "I'm ready, but I need someone to stand beside me when this explodes." Rachel nodded. "I called someone, an attorney who specializes in family and child welfare law. Her name is Sarah Whitfield. She's dealt with cases uglier than this." Moments later, a firm knock sounded at the door. David opened it to find Sarah Whitfield herself, standing tall under the porch light. She was in her early 40s, with sharp features softened by intelligent eyes, her auburn hair pinned neatly back. A dark trench coat hugged her slim figure, and she carried a leather briefcase that had clearly seen years of battles in court. Sarah had once worked as a state prosecutor, known for dismantling child exploitation rings in Tacoma, but her blunt honesty had made enemies in politics, pushing her into private practice. Still, her reputation remained unshaken. She fought like a soldier for children who had no voice. Inside, Sarah shook David's hand firmly. "Lieutenant Miller," she said, her voice clear, "I don't sugarcoat. The evidence you have is damning, but we need to handle this cleanly. If she senses what's coming, she'll fight like a cornered animal." David glanced at Sophie's drawing pinned to the refrigerator, a shaky picture of 3 figures holding hands with the word "Dad" scrawled above. His chest ached. She already has. They spent hours drafting a strategy. Rachel provided testimony of her observations. Margaret recounted what she had seen, but been too afraid to report. Sarah took notes swiftly, her pen scratching, against yellow legal pads. "We'll need to secure the children immediately once we move forward," Sarah said. "I'll file for an emergency protective order. But David, you'll need to be prepared for her to smear your name too. She'll claim neglect, claim you were absent, maybe even fabricate stories." David exhaled slowly. "Let her. I've ignored the truth too long. My silence made me complicit." The plan set. They agreed on timing. The confrontation would not happen in secret. It needed witnesses, people who could not deny what they saw. David arranged a dinner under the guise of hosting colleagues and community members, inviting trusted police officers as well as a few neighbors who had suspected something was wrong. If Victoria exploded, she would do so in front of them all. The following night, the Miller mansion shimmered under golden chandeliers, the table set with polished crystal and silver. Victoria glided into the dining room in a deep blue dress, her curls gleaming, her lips curved into the charming smile she wielded like a blade. To the guests, she was radiant, a picture of elegance and hospitality. To David, she was a predator in silk. Sophie sat quietly at his side, her small hand clutching the sleeve of his suit jacket under the table. Noah rested in a high chair, gnawing on a spoon, while Rocky lay stretched underfoot, his eyes alert. Halfway through the meal, David rose. He lifted his glass, his voice steady. "Thank you for being here tonight. I invited you not only to share a meal, but to share the truth." He signaled to Rachel, who activated the screen set up at the end of the room. The footage began to play. Gasps rippled through the guests as Victoria's voice filled the hall. "Eat it all, or don't expect to sleep in a bed tonight." They saw Sophie's tear-streaked face, Noah's frightened cries, Rocky growling as Victoria shoved him aside. Victoria's smile shattered instantly. She leapt from her chair, her voice shrill. "This is fake! Lies! David, how dare you!" But Sarah Whitfield stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor. She opened her briefcase and laid out documents across the table. Bank transfers, personal accounts, and witness testimony. "Mrs. Miller, the court will see all of this." The room fell into stunned silence. One neighbor, Mrs. Green, a stout woman in her 50s with silver streaks in her hair, whispered harshly, "I knew something was wrong. I heard the children crying through the walls." Another officer at the table stood, his expression hard. "Lieutenant Miller, we'll back you." Victoria's face twisted with rage. She turned towards Sophie, her hand rising in a sudden, desperate gesture. But Rocky was faster. The German shepherd sprang up with a deep bark, positioning himself between Sophie and Victoria, his teeth bared, his amber eyes blazing. The guests gasped as David pulled Sophie close, his arm shielding her. "Enough!" David roared, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded entire precincts. "No more lies, no more fear. This ends tonight." At that moment, the front door opened. 2 uniformed officers entered, summoned earlier by Sarah's petition. The taller one, Officer Lewis, was in his early 30s, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He had worked with David before, respected him as a mentor. His presence was a silent promise that the law was on their side. "Mrs. Miller," he said formally, "we have a warrant. You're under arrest." Victoria's scream echoed through the hall, shattering the glassy facade of the elegant dinner. She struggled as the officers gripped her arms, her accusations flying wildly, claims of betrayal, conspiracies, lies. But no one listened anymore. The evidence had spoken louder than her words ever could. As she was escorted out into the cold night, Sophie clung to her father's chest, her small body trembling. For the first time, she heard him speak words she had longed for. "You're safe now," David whispered into her hair. "I see you. I believe you, and I'll never let you be alone again." In the darkness that seemed to have no way out, a miracle came to Sophie and Noah. That miracle was not a light from somewhere far away, but the love awakened in the Father's heart. Many times, God does not give us miracles with thunder or strong winds, but through small actions, a hug, a word of trust, a timely protection. In this story, we clearly see that when people open their hearts and courageously face the truth, God's light will shine, dispelling all darkness. In daily life, you may have also found yourself exhausted, lost, or afraid. But remember, love and faith in God can turn seemingly impossible things into possible. A prayer, a hand extended at the right time, sometimes is the miracle that you or someone else needs. If this story has touched your heart, please leave a comment and share your feelings. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to spread more stories of faith, love, and hope together. And if you believe that God is always present, still working miracles for those who call upon Him, leave a simple but powerful comment. Amen.